Hello, welcome to another one of our chats, our regular weekly cycles. Today, we're going to talk a little about how to deal with violence, philosophically speaking. It's obvious that today it's a trendy topic and many solutions are proposed. But we are a school of philosophy. We don't claim to own the truth, not at all. However, we also have the right to present our stance, our perspective on the matter, or use a work as support, which we will talk about shortly, and I hope to add something to your reflection. Philosophy has precisely this ability and teaches exactly this skill to examine all the possibilities of a subject and teach, to reflect and draw your own conclusions. Therefore, what you might hear may not align at all with what you're used to hearing about this topic. In fact, it was one of the things that sparked my interest in philosophy, because when a question was posed, I would mentally imagine how I would respond. Then I realized that philosophy didn't match any of those preconceived answers I had, and it opened up a range of solutions that I had never mentally worked with, that I had never reflected upon. I hope that happens to you as well today in our little chat. So let's see. The book we'll be working with is this one, The Roots of Violence and Knowing to Avoid It. This is a book written by Professor Michel Etenique-Izaza, the professor who brought New Acropolis to Brazil. He has since passed away, but he was a very interesting figure in addition to being a very seasoned professor with a lot of experience. He was also an instructor of philosophical martial arts, and all this knowledge led him to develop his own line of thought. This 2010 book is a compilation of his thoughts. Of course, I will approach this by also mixing in viewpoints from other authors and even my own, as it's inevitable for that to happen. Enjoy. Let's start our chat. So, one of the things we must consider as a fundamental premise is that there is no human being in our society exempt from violence. The potential for violence is always latent within the human being. I know someone so peaceful who has nothing violent about them. I believe there is this possibility in the future of humanity. But in the present, as Plato said, we are a mix of one and the other. A mix of light and shadow. In other words, we have a certain amount of self-control, and opposite to true self-control, there is a lack of control. Also true. Total self-control is a wise person, total lack of control. It's a beast, perhaps dressed as a human, perhaps wearing a human mask, but a beast, like the wolf disguised as grandma. So, we are a mix of both, with larger or smaller doses of each side. To evolve is precisely to gain ground for what we are, human beings, against what we are not. All that has been left behind in our evolutionary process, all these shadows we carry on our backs. As Jung would say, you either face your shadows and master them, or you turn your back on them. And you are dominated from behind. You are attacked from behind. So, today let's learn a bit about this human potential to tip the scales in favor of the human being, of the human self that exists within. Well, an interesting thing I've had the chance to mention in other talks. It's almost funny, but I call it the recipe for being human. Yes, a recipe, like the ones where you have the ingredients, mix them, and you get a cake. There are also recipes for being human throughout history. The human being would have, if you were to compile various traditions, 3 component elements. You then have a physical part endowed with a temperament. This temperament in general is a family inheritance. It's an entire element that is a component of a family group. You must know that Italian family that everyone talks about a lot. Then you leave home, Grew up next to Italian neighbors, gesticulating, speaking loudly, the mom too, and the row of little kids, all gesticulating and speaking loudly. Or that family of shy people, everyone quiet. In other words, temperament is very biological and inherited. It's a more physical part of man, and it is neither good nor bad. It always has qualities that, if not well cultivated, can turn into flaws. For example, I've often given this example. A person who is very stubborn, if well cultivated, can become a very persevering person. A person who is very passionate, if well cultivated, can become a very enthusiastic person. These are traits of temperament. But the one who has to measure, educate, and direct this temperament is the second element of the recipe for being human, which is character. What is character? Character would basically be a learning process that allows you to appreciate what is good and reject what is bad. This is quite Platonic. Character allows you to like what is good for the human being. It's not a matter of guesswork or personal opinion. And then we get into another delicate subject, but one that we've also discussed quite a bit. The journey of the human being would be from ignorance to wisdom. Whether you go as an artist, a scientist, a psychologist, a politician, or whatever it may be, the paths are many, but the pinnacle of the pyramid is one, which is the human ideal. This human ideal is an ideal of values, virtues, and wisdom. It is the fullness of the human condition. So, this is the good, a well-established good, which is the pinnacle of the human condition. The pinnacle that the human being can offer us as nature, as a condition. So, everything that helps you climb the pyramid is good for you. Everything that makes you descend, animalizes you, would be bad for you. And, evidently, there are certain behaviors of temperament that make you descend, which are instinctive, raw. Brutal, violent, coarse, certain tendencies of temperament that make you rise. Organized, a tendency towards generosity, and so on, a bunch of elements. Character is an educator that comes into play. Nourishes the positive aspect and controls the negative element. It converts, sublimates, and turns these energies inside out. It transforms these energies into positive tendencies. So, it's as if you imagine that temperament is a horse, one of those wild horses that roam here and there, and character is the rider. And this rider takes the reins of temperament and directs it towards the top of the pyramid. It brings out the best in him. No temperament is perfect, no temperament is bad. All temperaments are dual, like everything in nature. We live in a world of dualities. And there is a third element. Well, it depends on the whole perception that a person has of life. But most of these traditions believe that a person has an immortal essence that has a message to deliver to the world. They have an essence that came to do something in the world, and so they wear this Socratic body, which is composed of temperament and character. And when he wears it, it's like a hand putting on a glove. This glove has to express him in the world. This essence comes to express itself through appearance. But for that, the glove has to be docile. It has to be flexible. It has to obey the control of the hand. Otherwise, this hand cannot accomplish its work in the world. So, character dominates temperament so that it becomes a flexible glove. Because when the hand of the spirit, when the hand of the essence enters, it controls this glove and acts in the world. Essence and appearance in harmony. Now, when there is a character, which is the intermediary element, that is poorly formed, be careful, because today we use this as a heavy pejorative. So-and-so is of bad character. In truth, there is no such thing as bad character. There is well-formed character, poorly formed character, and imperfectly formed character, which is the case for most of humanity. Because, as the singer Javan would say, who knows what it's like to not have and yet have to give? In other words, generally, our character wasn't formed all that well. Because those who formed it also hadn't received such a good formation themselves. This creates a vicious cycle. A well-formed character controls temperament to allow the manifestation of essence. A poorly formed character unleashes the temperament, suppresses the manifestation of the essence. So, when the body becomes lazy and dreams want to manifest, it says, "Poor thing, let it rest a little longer." No, that's not necessary. It can wait until later. It can wait for another moment. In other words, it turns around. It blocks the manifestation of the being and releases the temperament. So imagine it's as if you were under a lake. This is a frozen lake, and there's a diver down there trying to come to Iona. This is your essence, your spirit. And the character is up here, walking on the lake. When it notices this diver hitting a certain point, it can do two things: either dig along to help it come to Iona, or push more ice there with its foot and stomp, so that this being does not manifest. This is a well or poorly formed character. So, in this case, the temperament can be whatever it is. We will soon see the classification that is most well known for temperaments, which is not an absolute truth, but it's what we know best, which is a classification by the Roman physician Galen, who categorizes 4 temperaments. Whether there are 4 or 40, none of them is perfect. So, when temperament has a well-formed character, it channels its energies under the command of character, and both obey the being that manifests. In other words, it becomes a perfect glove. When the character is poorly formed, it allows the temperament to take over and blocks the spiritual self. So, the combination of these 3 elements would be the recipe for being human. So, the matter of a well-formed character, bringing out the best in temperament, is a necessity. This consists of a fundamental question of the human being, which is the human self versus the animal self. The animal self is not bad, but it came to serve us, to create an interface between us and the world. It has to be mastered, it has to be trained, it has to be guided. Just like we do with external animals. We have our little pets inside the house. I have several and we love them. I love them so much. But they cannot rule the house. They cannot give me orders. They cannot be the owners of the house, even for their own benefit. Otherwise, the house wouldn't offer even the slightest condition of comfort for anyone. They were not made to rule a house. But when they are mastered, they live very harmoniously and fit well into the household. It's the same thing within us. So, this equation of who dominates, the human self or the animal self, will be very decisive in our ability to deal with violence. So, this is the first element for us to understand well. I have placed this chart for you next, from the 3rd century AD, by a doctor named Galen, where he classifies the 4 temperaments. We even have, on our channel, this channel you're watching me on, from New Acropolis on YouTube, a lecture about these 4 temperaments. So, just to give you an idea, this chart shows defects and qualities. All of them are dual. Character dominates and converts negative energies into positive ones. Remember that myth I like to tell you about, the Egyptian myth where Set fights against Horus. Horus wants to avenge the death of his father, Osiris, by his brother, 7. And there is a fierce battle between the two and Horus. He wins, but he doesn't kill Set. Set, with all his fury, with all his drive, had a lot of energy. He has set below, with all this energy, the sails of the god's bark, which travels through eternity. In other words, things put in their proper place are not chaos. In other words, this energy taken from separateness, from hatred, and redirected towards unity, towards the sacred, can be very positive. The same goes for all the energies that exist within us. It's the same medieval story of the work in black, the work in white, and the work in red. The 3 alchemical works. So, as a curiosity here, we have a chart about Galen's 4 temperaments. Well, Professor Michel Eskenik, who wrote this book, as I've already mentioned to you, was a great martial arts master, especially in a martial art that was a style developed in Brazil by him, which is Neikun. And he used to say something very interesting, that sometimes a person arrives at a martial arts dojo, a tremendously peaceful person, perhaps even passive, and everyone believes that this person is completely devoid of violence. And in a tense situation, sometimes that person inside the dojo, which is like a miniature version of the world, manifests a beast in such a way that even they are startled. Because when you simply repress violence, if you consider what I mentioned at the beginning, every human being is born with this basic kit, and within this basic kit, there is also a tendency towards violence. The tendency towards aggression. You didn't see it, didn't work with it, didn't sublimate it, didn't convert it, you simply repressed it. So, you have to acknowledge that it's there. Remember Jung's shadows. If you don't look at it, if you turn your back on it, it will dominate you at some point. In a dojo situation where a person feels cornered, violence springs forth without any control, because they never tried to control it. So, it's an absolutely chaotic and dangerous element. Sometimes. And it happens sometimes more abruptly in people who showed the least signs in normal situations. In other words, it was latent there, waiting for an opportunity to manifest, so there is no one devoid of it. There are those who see and master it, and those who do not see and are mastered by it. And training is not education. I've mentioned it many times in other talks, but I really like this idea. Therefore, I repeat, moral consciousness is different from moral conditioning. Conditioning is don't do it with a whip repressing. Consciousness is don't do it because of that. Understand the consequences of internal and external harm. Realize that this is not human, that it doesn't lead you to your place in nature. So, I understand, and as an act of understanding, I no longer identify with it. This is moral consciousness, solid as steel. Moral conditioning, depending on the impact you make on it, it breaks. It's like a dam that breaks. You know what happens. It's a big mess. Well, culture, he will say, is a fundamental element because it's like a great formation of character. Character formation happens within your home family and also within your home state. Many elements of culture, when it is genuinely culture, help in the conscious mastery of human violence. Now, when we have a culture that is like a poorly formed character, it releases these elements. Culture comes from the Latin verb cholera, which meant to accompany the growth of plants, shares the same origin as agriculture. And this cholera or culture worked simply with an idea of knowing how to open the earth, place seeds inside, and cultivate it. In other words, imagine that culture would have to do this: open the soil of human nature, plant seeds of human values, and cultivate them so that these seeds could blossom and grow. In other words, culture should cultivate what man understands. Better yet, agriculture and, let's say, the humaniculture or something of that sort. In other words, it would have to cultivate the seeds of humanity within man. When it doesn't do this, when values are reversed, sometimes it starts to cultivate the animal self and suppress the human self. It's like a poorly formed character. A collective character, poorly formed, and we are experiencing something very similar to this today. Don't tell me, I can't believe that none of you have ever stopped to think that values are inverted. This is a counterculture, a culture that works in reverse. Well, another important thing we should talk about, and something that has often been emphasized, is not to have the syndrome of thinking that all the world's problems happen here. It's a problem of Brazil. It's a problem of Brazilians. There is no place in the world today that is not affected, to a greater or a lesser extent, by violence. Even those places that in the past were considered the most peaceful. For example, Tibet, which was once the isolated and extremely peaceful roof of the world. Today, after China's entry, we know there is a delicate situation, even within religions like Buddhism, which is a strong practitioner of the principle of ahimsa, nonviolence, which comes from Jainism. It also passes through Hinduism and Buddhism. Nonviolence is one of the principles of Buddhism. Today, we have Buddhist countries where violence is very active. Just look at the daily news from around the world and well know this. So, in corners where relative peace once reigned, today there is violence, sometimes at alarming levels. The crisis we are experiencing is not a localized crisis. Understand this. Get it into your heads. Anywhere in the world, you will find positive aspects of that culture to resist the crisis and negative aspects. It's not just in Brazil. We have positive aspects. our optimism, our resilience in the face of adversity, a certain humility in the sense of wanting to learn from what comes from outside. In other words, all of this. These are positive elements. But we also have negative elements. A certain inertia, a certain lack of initiative. Anyway, I won't delve into that aspect here. But the fact is, if there's one thing that has been globalized in the 21st century, it is the selfishness, the alienations, the violence, various problems that today are on a global scale. You could say that in history, there was something brilliant in Egypt and, well, I don't know. In the world of Asia Minor at the time, there was nothing so significant. There might have been, if you look at another place, even in Europe. There was nothing significant. Today is difficult. More or less the same values, whether the financial condition is better or worse. But generally, what does everyone want? A life with a certain amount of possessions to enjoy your comfort without thinking much about your neighbor, whether or not having these possessions. But the dream is more or less common. Along with human aspirations, human alienations have also spread, which facilitate the dissemination of violence. And this is without borders. The so-called Roman violence, which is the origin of our word violence, is quite similar. It could be divided into certain aspects. Violence directed, for example, at natural phenomena. A very strong storm is violent. It can rip roofs off houses. Anyway, I won't describe the damages. You know, a hurricane, not to mention a cyclone. So, violence practiced by nature, but that is part of a cycle. We know that these natural phenomena leave a trail of destruction. But from this land, what is born? Suddenly, cleaner lands, better conditions than before, and from there the whole process is reborn again. Unless it hits a civilizational core along the way. But nature, dealing with nature, understands itself well. It knows what it generates and it knows the new life that emerges from there. We also have animal violence, the ferocity animal. No one is naive enough to think they'll find only an idol in a forest. There's a lot of ferocity there. The bigger one devouring the smaller one, and so on successively, which also has its own logic. And when a lion chases after a group of deer, it's probably not going to catch the strongest ones. Those who are leading will catch the ones who are more fragile. Perhaps the sick, who are already possibly subject to contaminating the group with their illness. In the end, it purifies the group, allowing it to become faster. Younger, with more ability to defend themselves. And there is also a limit. A lion with a full belly doesn't hunt anymore, at least not in the following days, that day or the next. So, everything follows a certain cyclicality, a certain law of nature. The next form of violence is what we call human vehemence, which in Greece was known as hubris. Normally, it was the furies that occurred. To Hercules, which happened to many others, generating a series of trials, a redemption of those committed errors. The redemption of Hercules' madness was the 12 labors. In short, this hubris, this lack of control, this human excess, is already a more complicated type of violence. Because nature, with its atmospheric and meteorological phenomena, follows a logic where it knows how to resolve itself. Animals are also seeking survival and the perpetuation of their species, and they know how to resolve it. Now, this human hubris depends on human behavior to be resolved. It will not resolve itself. According to the cycles of nature, it will not resolve itself according to instincts. Each one resolves with the tools they have. Human excess would have to be resolved with human tools. Intelligence with creativity, with attention. In other words, human problems, human responses, and these are up to us to find them. We are the ones who must find the tools and the appropriate answers to our problems. It's an individual achievement, an individual merit, which then spreads to all of humanity through example. We can say that the modern man doesn't have a clear idea of this, what we just talked about. What is the human model? What is the human way of resolving things? Do you realize this? That each person, according to their nature, their identity, their vocations, their talents, has their own way of resolving things, which is not necessarily better or worse than another's, but complementary. Sometimes, by combining the solutions of all people, you arrive at a good solution for a specific problem. We would need to find our model. In this case, our model as humanity. What is the human way of confronting violence? Excess, imbalance, the loss of self-control. In other words, what we call a model, or what Jung would call an archetype, or what Plato would call the idea from the realm of ideas. I presented to you a diagram so you can see a diagram that Plato uses in the Republic to explain to Glaucon, who was one of the young men debating with him there. How does a man become contaminated by ideas that are not human ideas? It's the so-called myth of Glaucon Marini. He says the following: imagine a man falls into the waters, and the waters are the symbol of the material world. Horizontality, while fire is the symbol of the spiritual world, verticality. Spirit and matter form the cross of the world. When a man falls into the waters, it means he has fallen into the material world. And then he starts to pick up various other things. I don't know, algae, crustaceans start sticking to him. It starts corroding some parts, deforming others. In such a way that when you take this body out of the sea, it is so deformed that you no longer recognize it as a human body. Then he illustrates this in a symbolic way. Well, we fall into the world. Material. Instead of looking at the realm of ideas and grasping the human idea, we take a piece of the idea of stones, which is inertia, evolution through resistance, through inertia, and we take this upon ourselves. Well, inertia, which is good in a stone, which is good in a door that no one can break down, in us, turns into laziness. Then we look up and see the model of plants, which evolve through their ability to seek, recycle, and reuse energy. In other words, they live by capturing energies. This energy capture of plants, when it falls into us, turns into an excessive ambition, a constant desire to receive all kinds of energy. In plants, it's a virtue, but in us, it becomes vices. Then we look at the archetype of animals, which has as its basic idea in its evolution the instinct of species preservation and the instinct of survival. For the animal, this is the law: do good, and good will come to you. Your message, it fulfills its role in the world well. In humans, living solely subject to instincts of survival and species perpetuation leads to violence, aggression, selfishness. It's a bunch of things that make us more animalistic. And we take a little bit of the human archetype, which consists of generating values, virtues, and wisdom, to get closer to this humanistic ideal, to occupy your space. So, a little bit of everything, and it becomes deformed. It turns into something like a Frankenstein. So, knowing how to find the human way to solve things, that's so original. You'll see that today we have the topic of violence being widely debated. And in general, we fall back on alternatives that are inherent to animal nature. It's very difficult. Practically, with the exception of this book, I've never seen anyone address the solution to violence from a human perspective. In other words, it's not the corners of the triangle, it's the apex. Something that is at the center, but above. It no longer has anything to do with the duality of animal nature. Continuing, I will explain this better in a moment. This phrase belongs to the founder of New Acropolis, Professor Jorge Ángel Livraga Rizzi. He said something very simple and very interesting. In a world where everything is in motion, those who do not move forward fall behind. It seems obvious, but it's not so obvious. So, if you notice that nature is constantly evolving, the stones are improving. Their molecular organization, the plants, making their form of survival increasingly complex. Animals too, but humans halt at human evolution. In other words, it's clear that if he doesn't keep up in a world where everything is advancing, he ends up regressing and becoming increasingly animalistic. The animalization of the human condition is a visible phenomenon in today's world. I don't even need to give you an example. Most of the time, when we expect human behavior, we get animal behavior, purely instinctive, purely selfish. And it's like there's a vacuum of human beings, a space that is not occupied. There's a passage that I find interesting. In Helena Blavatsky, she mentions that it's not advisable to take a dog. It wouldn't be very recommendable. Although we do, and stimulate its ferocity, its violence. To make it serve you, to make it defend a home. Because you would be, imagine that you took the dog throughout history, domesticated it, brought it closer to humans, refining its intelligence. In a way, it sometimes seems like they think, they just can't speak. When you stimulate brutal elements back there, you are not contributing to their evolution. You're pulling it back to the past. So, the animal was refining itself, becoming increasingly subtle, more refined, and you're pulling it towards that more brutal world, that more brutal condition. If even a dog becomes brutalized and regresses with violence, what can be said of a human being? That would have to be even more refined, with a potential, with a universe of possibilities much higher and broader, because tools were given to him for this purpose. So violence brutalizes even dogs, let alone humans. I'm not trying to present these as absolute truths, but reflect on them. I am a philosopher, I don't have absolute truths, but reflect on all these ideas. Well, and then Professor Michel Echenique talks about causes, which I am summarizing here. Obviously, it's not a very big book, of 100 pages. But in any case, it's quite large for such a small lecture. So he talks about some causes, of some of the so-called triggers of violence. One of them is precisely the conflicts on the four sides of the pyramid. What does that mean? Classically, it was considered that man has a goal, which is the apex of the pyramid. We mentioned earlier that it is the human ideal. It is the highest that the human condition can achieve. Of values, virtues, and wisdom, self-control, control of the animal so that the human can flourish. And this apex of the pyramid would be reached through four great faces. Of course, with a series of details and countless subdivisions within them. But basically, the civilizational pyramid, which tries to pull man upwards, is built to elevate humanity. Has four faces. What would be science? Religion, the politics and art. That's right, science, religion, politics, and art. Then you might ask me, where's philosophy? Philosophy is not one of the four faces of the civilizational pyramid. It is a tool that allows you to know if everything being presented as science is truly science. What is being presented as art, as politics, as religion? Is it truly art, politics, or religion? So, it's like a spiral that touches and ascends from within. Comparing the four faces, gathering the best of what each has done, identifying each one. In other words, philosophy is the love of wisdom, knowledge in relation to anything in life. Those who love wisdom want to know how to live well, want to know how to take good care of their plants. To all corners, he projects this investigative gaze with the intent to benefit. But then, these four faces, when we don't have a very good character formation, instead of relying on them to rise together, helping and supporting each other to grow, there is a competition embedded in each of them, where, within each of these faces, people start to compete and push each other down, instead of rising together and encouraging each other to thrive. So there are conflicts within science, there are conflicts within art, and, above all, there are conflicts within politics and within religion. And these conflicts, where we use tools that were meant for growth to generate violence, these conflicts are one of the most powerful sources where aggression arises nowadays. We don't know how to properly use the faces of the pyramid. These are the fields where violence generally takes root. We don't know how to use these as tools to awaken consciousness and help us grow. We don't know how to help each other in this ascent. So it's a geometric question. If we are getting closer and more harmonious with each other, it's a sign that we are ascending. If we are increasingly distant, as we are now, it's a sign that we are descending. We are probably descending, increasingly more antagonistic and distant. He will continue talking about education. This is a key. Everyone says that the problem of violence is a matter of education. The problem of violence is a matter of ignorance. Let's delve a little into these two topics today. Of course, it's education. But what kind of education? Is it an informative education that just dumps data? Or is it a formative education that brings out the best in the human being to Iona? Education comes from educe, which is precisely to bring to Iona, to make flourish what is within a person like seeds, what exists, deeper and more true. To make your essence flourish, to let the essence dominate the glove, dominate the appearance. In other words, education helps the human being to align with what is best within them so that this best can prevail. Your survival tools. The animal self is not bad, but when poorly educated, it can indeed be an obstacle to the growth of the human self. So, education helps to turn this game around, to ensure that the human becomes a good trainer of their animal self, and both are harmonious in the ascent of the pyramid. There is the concept of representation, which I really like, and I've talked about it many times. What does representation mean? Imagine that we have a class of students, and I don't know, Joao didn't come. Someone can represent him because he is absent. Now, if Joao is present, no one can represent him. To represent means to take the place of something or someone who is absent. So, imagine a child, a young person, who is going through an educational process. They are still developing some basic elements of their personality. If we use classical concepts, he starts by mastering the physical body, then manifesting and then mastering his energies. Then he enters a phase driven by emotions, passions, and that bombardment, and he has to learn to deal with it. And finally, you will manifest that mind that will help you control all of this and give a higher direction to your life. They even say that this would happen in 7-year cycles. Hence, adulthood would be at 21 years old, which would be the third 7-year cycle, bridging the emotions and the mind. But that's a tradition, with many details. I won't elaborate on that now. But anyway, understand that this child, this young person, until reaching this third 7-year cycle, needs someone to control these basic forces of their personality, so that he doesn't jeopardize himself, doesn't compromise his life due to lack of control. So, imagine that your human self hasn't emerged yet. It wasn't his moment to awaken. Another must step in. A human self, then, controlling the development of this personality as if it were his own, representing what is absent. Guiding this personality so that it is well formed, whether because the physical body has a certain discipline in terms of nutrition, rest, exercise, so that energies are not spent in a way that degrades dignity, compromising the physical health of that young person, that child, so that emotions do not create a disorder in life, leading to vices and imbalances that could be dangerous for the future. In other words, a human self must step in here, substituting for the one that is still absent. This would be the representative of your own human self. And this representative is, indeed, the human self of an educator. He represents and educates the personality in such a way that, when your own human self emerges, he hands it over to the guide. And he finds a personality ready to obey him. Otherwise, when the human self emerges, he finds a personality already completely unstructured, rebellious, and entangled with elements that prevent him from fully taking charge. Now, the crucial question that arises here. How can a person represent the human self for another? Someone, when this human self is not yet present in them. If the human self doesn't have control within him, how can he represent the human self of another? How can he represent something that is absent in him? Is it also absent? Do you understand this? In other words, it follows that the fundamental condition of the educator, there's a talk where I discuss this a lot. Philosophy and education, the fundamental condition of the educator is the connection of consciousness with the being. It's a level of human maturity. Above, solidity, mastery, self-control, and the presence of well-established human elements, which give him the ability to represent this in another being in formation. So, you might consider, for example, that in a classical society, the ideal for an educator would be virtue. Virtue, not merely intellectual knowledge, because merely intellectual knowledge, if you need it out of love, you acquire it very quickly. Now, if there is no contact with virtue, with values, with wisdom, no sobriety, maturity, self control, it's not something you acquire quickly. So, the true educator is a representative of elements, and these elements, through him, will serve as a reference for the students. So, within education, you would need to cultivate nonviolent human beings, people who have awareness and control over the violence within themselves, to represent this element. So, it will be an important element. Do we have this? How is our education nowadays? It is much more focused on the quantitative than the qualitative, for information rather than formation. And these concepts of values, virtues, are already quite secondary, very competitive and aiming to generate skills rather than virtues. All of this could fill an entire lecture to discuss. But anyway, this is one of the factors of violence. He also talks about vices, like drugs and alcohol, simply because drugs and alcohol diminish the power of consciousness, diminish clarity. And when you loosen, so to speak, the control you have over the leash, the little pet becomes more disobedient and gets into more mischief. So, if we lessen our control over the animal, that's when it really takes over the house. So, human consciousness is something to be developed, not minimized. One of the things that was considered immoral in the classical world was exchanging human consciousness for pleasures, comforts, or entertainments, whatever they may be. Because human consciousness is precisely the factor we are working to develop, and it is too precious for you to trade for anything. So, vices tend to weaken a man's ability to control his impulses. Animalistic, and violence is one of them. Once again, it's a matter of culture, which is the promotion of flaws and the devaluation of virtues. So, if today a person is very lazy, they feel quite comfortable talking about it. In public, talking with friends. Now, if she is a very well-disposed person, wakes up early, does all her tasks, she has a certain fear of saying this in public. She might be labeled as tough, old-fashioned, or someone who doesn't know how to live. If a person is very generous, they fear speaking like that in public. They might be considered a prodigal, someone who doesn't know how to use their resources positively. Now, if someone is a spender, if they are completely out of control, they enjoy it, they share it. They find it amusing to show the exotic ways they've devised to squander their wealth. So notice that it is socially accepted, the flaw, not the virtue. If a person is critical and likes to talk about everyone, that's well accepted, well shared. Now, if someone is sober and doesn't like to talk about anyone, or if they are arrogant, vain, they think they are better than us. Notice that this is a very strong social element. We have a counterculture that ridicules virtue and emphasizes vice as more spontaneous, as the most human. So, it takes a strong sense of individuality to have virtues swimming against the current, because the current of our historical moment does not favor the pursuit of virtues. Quite the opposite. It values the animalistic, the spontaneous, in quotes, the release of what is worst in man. Well, another element, which is quite broad, one of the causes of violence, is selfishness. Certainly, I've already mentioned to you that the Tibetan tradition, as addressed by Helena Blavatsky in a book called The Voice of the Silence, considers the greatest evil in the world to be the heresy of separateness, which is nothing more than selfishness. And selfishness, ultimately, is behind practically all the problems we face, on a collective level as well as on an individual level. So, using others as a means to obtain satisfaction. Cowardice, the lack of consideration for others' feelings, and excessive self-centeredness are already forms of violence in themselves. There are countless ways to practice violence. Selfishness is already a brutal form of violence in itself, and other forms of violence are born from there. Indifference to others' feelings, using others' emotions for amusement, the use of another person's life to provide you with some kind of pleasure. Kant already said that using a rational being as a means to achieve selfish ends is one of the greatest immoralities. Almost any ends that use a human being as a means will always be selfish and immoral. Today, I would say that we can consider even more than that the use of any being in nature for selfish purposes, using the life around us merely as a means and not as an end in itself, brutalizes us. Because we live the consequences of this socially. Today, a good education allows for human responses to life. Think of a simple and verifiable formula. You want to know if a person is well educated. Put them in a difficult situation and see how they respond. We all have our significant shortcomings in education. And in the circumstances of life, we can perceive this. By your deeds, I will know you. Look at your trail. What are the responses you give to life? In front of a person who deceives you, in front of a person who lies to you, in front of a person who undermines you, in front of a person who is disloyal. In short, all these ups and downs we go through and their opposites as well. Once again, the world is dual, it's inevitable. We won't be able to go through the world and have everything be peaceful, everything perfect. There are always variations. Just the other day, I was giving it once again. The lecture about Stephen Pressfield, The War of Art, which is a talk I really enjoy. And I remembered a passage now that he mentioned which was very interesting. He went to play golf in England. And Cade, who stands there with the clubs, observing, and he picked up the club. He did all his calculations. I don't understand anything about golf, I don't know how that would be, but the fact is he was prepared for a perfect shot. But when he played, a gust of wind came and pushed the ball off its trajectory. It curved and didn't fall into the corresponding hole. I don't even know if that's what it's called. Forgive my ignorance about golf. But the fact is that he got very irritated. Look at the absurdity. If it weren't for that wind, I would have made the shot. And the young man with the clubs turned to him. He said he gave that English smile and said, "You have to account for the wind, my friend." Be in the world. Wind, you're not on a perfect field, only in heaven. You're in a place that has dualities. You're a good player. Account for everything. If you didn't account for it, that's your own shortcoming. So it's good for us to consider this. We must have the ability to provide human responses to fields, where it blows, where it doesn't. Where the grass is flat, where the grass is full of holes, full of bumps, we must know how to give human responses in the face of the world's duality. Don't think of us as poor little things, as if we're incapable of this. We are a humanity capable of calculating the speed at which a comet swiftly passes through our system in our vast universe. We are capable of calculating the speed and development of a particular particle in its journey, whose information has reached us over billions of years. We are capable of fantastic things, whatever we desire. In general, we have an extraordinary ability to respond. Therefore, what we don't find answers to, not even within the ordinary, is because I believe that violence has been very poorly addressed so far. It means we're not searching. Because it's incredible the answers we are capable of finding when we are truly interested in them. Another important element, that he mentions in this book by Professor Michel Chenik, which I find very interesting. External power, without internal power, generates violence. Do you understand this? Without internal power, without self-control, without balance, if you put power in this person's hands, they will be violent. Confucius already spoke about this. One cannot lead who does not know how to obey. And obey your principles, obey your values. Has a certain self-control, a certain center. Internal values, to which one does not renounce, this person has the ability to lead externally. So, power in our world has become somewhat stigmatized. People deny power, and this ends up creating weakness. And this stigma arose because we only pursued external power, not internal power. Firstly, this internal power would give a person the possibility of absolute wisdom and righteousness in exercising external power. We must develop virtues that oppose violence rather than just suppressing it. So consider that within us, it's as if there's a battlefield. We have violence, and on this side, we have the possibility of reflection, of generosity, attention, imagination, intelligence, love, a series of things that, if you strengthen, soon become greater than the enemy and allow you to confront and dominate it. So, the enemy is this big. If I try to fight violence now, with the tiny virtues I have, I'm going to get beaten up. But if, instead of trying to cage violence, I develop the opposing virtues, when the conflict arises, these virtues are capable of overcoming that violence. It's not something where I have to be suppressing violence, because I've already told you, repression doesn't work. At some point, that cage bursts at some point. This control diminishes, and the violence is devastating because it never. That was dominated, so if you strengthen the virtues, you have internal tools for when violence manifests to have something more powerful than it. That can control it. In other words, nothing is more powerful for mastering internal violence than developing virtues. And by mastering internal violence, we have the possibility to act on the external. We'll take a closer look at this in just a moment. In the most interesting part of the book, what exactly is coming up next? The cycle of violence and victim. What you can say is the most original and interesting about this book. Professor Michel Echenique will tell us that there is a duality that is balanced. Without victims, there is no violence. Violence needs prey. Therefore, there must be beings with the profile of prey to feed the circuit. Look, don't get me wrong, because today we live in an international moment of hasty interpretations, prejudiced to label things before understanding them. I'm not trying to say that a person who is a victim of violence is to blame for the violence happening. No. Epictetus, the Roman slave, used to say that the extinction of guilt marks the beginning of moral progress. There are no culprits. But there are indeed people who, when they place themselves in a certain position, unconsciously feed the process, turn the coil, and make it perpetuate. And by becoming aware of this and starting to work on it correctly, they can correct it. And there's an element he's going to talk about, which is fantastic too. There is a whole manipulation that makes us believe that violence is absolutely random, that there is no logic in the process. And since there is no logic in the process, we feel like there's nothing we can do. Simply retreating and waiting for someone to do something for us, we find ourselves in an extremely passive position. Or we go to the other side and find ourselves in an extremely aggressive position. It's not true. Nothing in the universe is random. And this is philosophy in the classical tradition, and increasingly, science is moving in that direction too. Because it has found explanations for things that seemed absolutely chaotic and disordered a century ago. So, we begin to realize that the universe is filled with logic, intelligence, connection, causes, and effects. Violence is not an exception. So there are causes and effects. And within the Dax syllogism, you can intervene to break the causes and prevent many of the effects. How? Being human will explain this shortly. So there are no culprits, but there are indeed the unprepared. And when we are prepared, we can understand the machinery of violence and begin to work on dismantling it. Well, he will say that the psychology of the victim is a well-known subject. It's no longer news. It's widely covered in police academies. I think, unfortunately, it seems it's also widely covered in the schools of criminals, because both are very familiar with this idea. So, imagine yourself a criminal. As much as we might think otherwise, in a violent situation, the greatest risk is his, because he is doing something that is against the law. Any small mistake can lead to his arrest, his death, severe physical harm. He is in a situation where he has to be quick and efficient, because otherwise everything is lost. So, the most fragile situation is his. So, he won't take risks in situations where he doesn't feel there's a prejudged possibility that it will work out. You know that story they tell us when we're deciding whether or not to put a lock on a car? Well, there are excellent locks on the market, but honestly, between us, there is no lock that I have known to this day. I don't know if there will ever be one. That truly prevents someone from stealing a car if they really want to. Now imagine a criminal has a limited amount of time, needs to be quick, needs speed, and needs to do it in the most practical way possible, because his situation could lead to him being caught at any moment. This can result in a significant loss. Obviously, if he has 20 options, he won't want to take the car with the most complex lock. It sets up an obstacle that, if he has to choose, it won't be this one. You might say, but that's selfish. I'm only thinking about myself. No, ideally, all cars would have this lock if that were possible. And that all human beings would have this obstacle too. If one embodies it, they become a reference for how this can be done. So, what would be this human lock that would allow us to be like that? Let's say a not very recommended candidate. For a criminal observing to choose you as a victim. In just a few seconds, the criminal has a certain psychology. In just a few seconds, sometimes minutes, he can tell if someone is an easy target or if they might pose some difficulty. Imagine yourself, to make this clearer, a dog. A dog when it's attacked, when it's threatened. Well, if it's an untrained dog, a dog that hasn't undergone any kind of training. Or not. It's a large dog. It will run terrified, reacting with panic, with fear. If it's a trained dog, a guard dog, it will react aggressively. It will leap at the attacker with force. This passivity or this violence are the axis of animal consciousness. They are an instinctive pattern. In other words, we are either brutal, like a wild animal, or passive, like a stone. This duality of animal consciousness, an instinctive pattern of reaction, either freezes, tries to flee, or becomes aggressive, is very predictable. Since humans don't develop much of their human self, their responses remain in this polarity, which is very predictable. Or he will lose control and panic, and you immobilize him quickly with a shot, a blow, or he becomes catatonic, paralyzed, and you can manipulate him and do whatever you want. Beyond that, it's a lot of insecurity. So, sometimes, through behavior, the way someone walks absent-mindedly, through their gaze, how easily they get intimidated, through a series of elements, one can deduce. Does this have or not have the psychology of a victim? Does this one have it or not? Is this person a passive victim or not? An easy victim? A person who walks attentively, observing each step they take, every noise they notice, look into people's eyes, they are present with intelligence, with imagination, lucid. I don't know what will come from that. That is unpredictable. Risk? It's very significant because it escapes the predictable pattern of instincts, which is always passivity or violence. Notice that it's the same thing within society. When they offer you solutions to violence, generally, they'll present you with alternatives of passivity or even more violence. I don't believe that either of them solves anything. With passivity, you'll remain passive until you're killed, the last victim. And with violence, they'll keep killing each other, aggressors and the attacked, until the last one turns off the light of life, too. And nor, too, is a human solution. It's an instinctive pattern. The human pattern is no longer predictable. A person with lucidity, intelligence, attention, initiative, self-control, you don't know what will come from that. And developing this human pattern is possible because I emphasize it quite strongly here. Someone might say to me that I don't have that much intelligence. I don't have initiative or self-control. If you don't have it, cultivate it. And we have the possibility to develop it. And that would be precisely human evolution. Develop human potentials. Don't think that the human being is a finished product. He is in constant construction. Refine your human tools. And you can, indeed, have very powerful tools. Because, you see, there is no being in nature that has as much capacity to withstand adverse situations as the human being, thanks to their intelligence. And not through physical strength, nor through passivity. Professor Michel Echenique always tells a story which I obviously heard from him because, well, I don't have any recollection of it from that time. What might have happened in the 1970s in the city of Sao Paulo? It would have been one of the first so-called kidnappings with hostages, a robbery that ends in a kidnapping with hostages. A house had been robbed, the police had surrounded it, and since it was something very new, television cameras were all filming and broadcasting to various places. And in this robbery, as the house was surrounded, the criminals left taking a man and his son. A slightly older young man and a very elderly gentleman, around 70 years old, were taken as hostages. All of this was being broadcast on TV. And then it is said that you could clearly see the behavior of the two very different, because the adult, who was the son, was paralyzed. Tense. Without much reaction, he walked very mechanically, not even looking to the sides, whereas the 70-year-old gentleman was all the while very natural, maintaining his composure and walking as if he were chatting with friends, gesturing and talking to the criminal beside him. Very natural, and this was something that was somewhat unpredictable given the circumstances. It was a bit unusual. I know that, at a certain moment, when they are placed inside the car, the young man sits in the front and the old man in the back, with the criminal, with the gun in front, driving. He kept talking, 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 at a certain moment, in that movement, conversing in a very spontaneous way. It is said that he makes a lightning-fast gesture, where he grabs the gun from the criminal's hand and throws it out the car window, ending the robbery right there. No one imagined that could happen, but from a man, in that situation, anything could emerge. A man like that, the criminal runs miles away from him because he doesn't know what might happen. Or he kills him immediately, which is a bit strange at the beginning of the robbery. Or he will be at risk all the time because he is a box of surprises. A human being, with all the potential they have, is a box of surprises. And this is a situation that clearly shows how full of tools human nature is. This and perhaps many others much better. Notice, folks, that it's important for us to emphasize. There isn't, at least as far as I know, maybe there is, but it's rare to find a being born as unprotected as a human being. Any little animal is born with some ability to run, to use claws, use teeth, use a sting, something to defend itself with. The human being is absolutely unprotected, fragile, with exposed skin, unable to walk, defenseless. This element, which is practically considered a disadvantage, means that nature did not make us to defend ourselves with strength, nor to be passive, but to defend ourselves through intelligence, which is much more powerful. So, this fragile and unprotected being, when it develops, and develops its human potential, it is capable of draining swamps, of irrigating deserts. To create an atomic accelerator that calculates a particle from the beginning of the universe's manifestation, the power that human attributes give to man is enormous. If we can master physical nature, plant nature, animal nature, if we want to, can't we also use that to master human nature? Of course we can. Of course we can. If we dedicate ourselves to using all human attributes of intelligence, skill, imagination, and attention to master violence, not in a storm or a tornado, but within the human being. Finding the trigger, what to do, how to react more effectively when you face a dangerous situation. Even technology for this could be considered. The best reactions, the best ways out, the best methods to signal that you are in danger in the quickest and most subtle way. Much could be done if this were a focus. Don't tell me that's not possible. The human being has virtues, sufficient virtues to develop human responses to violence, which, although it is within the human being, is not human, it is animal. If he can subdue the animal outside, he can subdue it inside, but this is not developed. Our path is always one of complacency, where we either fall into passivity or into counter-violence. Neither of these solves the problem. You might say, wow, but that's very time-consuming and labor-intensive. Yeah, it really is. It's time-consuming and labor-intensive, but once we achieve it, we never lose it again. And it's a solid solution, one that we never lose again. We never need to light candles inside the house anymore. We have electricity. We never need to again, at least for those who have access to these resources, which, unfortunately, not everyone does. We no longer need to run after a well or anything like that to fetch water. Water is brought right into our homes. Well, it's true that not all human beings have access to this, and that's a problem. But this technology is brilliant. Let's keep drawing. It's brilliant that we have certain machines capable of taking us from one place to another so effectively. How can man master so many external elements and so few internal ones? The same intelligence that performed wonders outside can do so within. Find solutions, quick ways to address violence that practically make the existence of the victim unfeasible. Any inventor who puts their genius to work in a way that quickly signals how a person is being victimized, in such a way that it becomes unfeasible for the thief. You would discover things because you don't need much imagination. Ideas start to emerge. Anyone who focuses on an effective strategy, the best approach to save time. To get help, you'll find creative solutions, and they are human solutions, more time-consuming, more laborious, more definitive. When you make the victim unfeasible, you make the aggressor unfeasible. Human beings will have to channel their aggression in another direction, to the point where it has nowhere else to go, and he has to deal with it. In other words, you've broken the polarity. You have no victim, no aggressor. What do you mean? Who are you going to attack? There is no more vulnerability. There is no more cycle. The cycle is broken. And human beings are magnificent at finding answers when they truly seek them. Greater than the one who wins 1,000 battles is the one who conquers themselves. You know this one, coming from a mappa, from the Buddhist. Yama Kasavaga, more than 1,000 victories in external battles. The battle that truly matters is the one where you conquer yourself. Today, subdued your animal self, you have clarity, intelligence, willpower, generosity, creativity. You are a force to be reckoned with. What violence, because violence always dehumanizes. What violence can stand against a human being? Violence is animalistic. No matter how gigantic and ferocious some animals may be, they are not capable of opposing human beings. There are no more animals on Earth like that. I think if dinosaurs were around today, none of them would be a match for humans. Why do our little pets still enslave us? Understand this: when human potential blossoms, nothing that opposes it can be victorious. Work towards this. Human nature, when used to its full potential, holds extraordinary power. We must believe in and develop human nature. One of the things that philosophy focuses on is exactly this: believing in the human being. A brilliant idea, a grand idea. Work to develop this idea to the fullest of its possibilities. And then you find the answer to everything. The best thing we can do for those we love and for ourselves. Inclusivity. It's about growing as human beings. In this way, we benefit all of humanity and contribute decisively to solving problems. Overcoming internal violence means mastering the animal self, which enslaves and limits the human self. Our animal self is violent towards our human self. If you break this first violence, the others all become much easier to break. The external is always a consequence of the internal. Man has tamed animals on the outside and has the power to tame the animals within. Understanding is intelligence. Intelligence is like understanding, choosing among. Choose, among the countless voices within you, who you truly are. The highest act of intelligence is identity. Choose who you are amidst everything that suggests who you should be. You are not a beast, not a passive stone, nor a violent creature. You are a human being. You master the brutal factors through intelligence, creativity, and attention. Culture, education, civilization, all of this should come together to bring out this element. For humans to take the reins in solving their problems. Basically, that's what I wanted to share with you today. Reflect on this a little. Notice that the solutions proposed are always solutions that don't focus on helping the human being grow as a human being, but, like an animal, confronting as if they were two bulls locking horns with each other, or else become the prey in defense or turn into the violent beast. Neither of these resolves anything. In both cases, it will end in destruction. When you choose the human path, you will end in construction. All things harmonize, everything in its place. The animal is tamed, not eliminated. Your best energies are channeled. the knight guides the horse, and we all reach the pinnacle of the pyramid together. As I was saying to you, philosophy always offers human solutions. Don't fall into that fallacy of the excluded middle. It's either this or that. There is always a third option. And, in general, more elevated, the tip of the triangle, neither passive nor fierce. By embracing our humanity, we certainly find consistent solutions, brilliant and enduring. I hope this has been a good reflection for you. And thank you very much for being here.